"Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus answered him. It's in Matthew 22:37.
Jesus replies, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind."
Okay, you can read the rest.
This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself.
And all the law and prophets hang on these two. It's like, okay, we don't need anything else. We just need to know those two. That's the greatest commandment. Well, in today's scene, which I like to keep you in suspense, as you can see, we will see a vivid example of what it could mean to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then after I take off the sheet, or while I'm taking off, if you could turn to Daniel 3. Do you guys have the Bible? Daniel 3, and we're going to read 6 verses each, and I'll read the first 6 verses. Let's hope I don't tear down anything now. Oh, Rob, you know what? I talked to Lou Wilson today, and I was telling him about how we were doing this, and my black light quit working. He goes, "I've got it." He said, "I don't know where it is, but if I can find it, you can have it."
There you go. That's a good way to replace it.
All right, so we're on Daniel 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. How high is 90 feet? This room is only like, what, 10 or 8? So it'd be quite a bit higher than that.
Yeah.
Then he sent messages to all the princes, governors, captains, judges. I know we all have different versions, so just whatever you have is fine. Treasurers, counselors, sheriffs, and the rulers of all the provinces of his empire to come to the dedication of his statue. And when they had all arrived and were standing before the monument, a herald shouted out, "O people of all nations and languages, this is the king's command. When the band strikes up, you will fall to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a flaming furnace." Okay, who wants to go next? Verse 7.
So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshipped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king! You issued a decree requiring all people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach,
Meshach, and Abednego.
whom you have put in charge of the province in Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up."
Yeah, and those names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were their names when they came to Babylon, but King Nebuchadnezzar changed them to Babylonian names. And I can't even say them, so I'm glad they have their first names here. Okay, verse 13.
I think Anna's doing it.
Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my power." Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into a blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up."
Okay, verse 19.
Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent, and the furnace so hot, that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace.
Okay, 24.
Suddenly the king jumped up and shouted, "Weren't only 3 men tied up and thrown into the fire?" "Yes, your majesty," his officers answered. "But I see 4 men walking around in the fire," the king replied. "None of them is tied up or harmed, and the 4th one looks like a god." Nebuchadnezzar went closer to the flaming furnace and said to the 3 young men, "You servants of the Most High God, come out at once." They came out, and the king's high officials, governors, and advisors all crowded around them. The men were not burned, and their hair wasn't scorched, and their clothes didn't even smell like smoke. Continue.
Yeah.
King Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise their God for sending an angel to rescue his servants. They trusted their God and refused to obey my commands. Yes, they chose to die rather than to worship or serve any god except their own. And I won't allow people of any nation or race to say anything against their God. Anyone who does will be chopped up, and their houses will be torn down,
Wow.
because no other God has such great power to save."
Yeah. And then he gave promotions to those guys. Okay. There was some comments on there that if we were faced with something like that, we could make a lot of excuses. Like, well, I can bow down, but I don't really mean it. God knows that. So I was thinking, yeah, there probably would be a lot of excuses you could make that would sound good, but these guys stuck to their guns. So, let's see what's next on the agenda here. Did we read Matthew? Lisa, did you read
Yeah,
that?
I read Matthew.
Okay, that was the one about the greatest commandment. Okay, so these guys were very dedicated to the one true God, and they weren't going to be fooled. So what do we know about Nebuchadnezzar? I just had a few notes in this book about him. I also had some scriptures, but I'll just read this. Nebuchadnezzar was one world leader who decided he could get more cooperation from the people he conquered by letting them keep their gods. Their lands he took, their riches he looted, their lives he controlled, but he allowed them to worship their idols, sometimes even worshiping them himself. Nebuchadnezzar's plan worked well, with one glaring exception. When he conquered the little nation of Judah, he met a God, capital G, who demanded exclusive worship, not just his share among many. Nebuchadnezzar had always been able to rule the God, small g. This new God, capital G, was different. this God dared to claim that he had made Nebuchadnezzar all that he was, and one of the great conquerors in history was himself conquered by his creator. Okay, so that's something about Nebuchadnezzar. There's a lot of stuff we could tell about him, what kind of person he was, but he, in some of the verses, like in Chronicles and Kings, it seems to say, in Chronicles it said, the Lord, by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, sent people of Judah and Jerusalem to Babylon. It's like God was controlling him. I mean, we say he's such a terrible guy, and yet he was being
There's a little dog that was swatting at your screen.
Yeah,
So
she's
he-
knocking. She wants to come in.
She wants to hear about it. And in 2 Kings, as you know, he removed all the treasures from the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, and he took away all the articles of gold that Solomon, king of Israel, had made for the temple of the Lord. Okay, so we read all of that stuff. We read everything I've got down here. So let's just look at the picture and see what we see. You have any questions about this?
What shows up in the black light?
Oh, good question. See right here, you can barely see it. There's the face of Jesus right there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had, in my felt scene, I had an extra, so that when Nebuchadnezzar said, we only threw 3 guys into there, and I see 4.
Okay, got it.
And the one looks like one of the gods. And so there they are, and what a miracle. Can you imagine? They trusted God enough to be thrown in when they were bound, and it said their hair wasn't singed, their clothes weren't burned, and even the guys who threw them in, the heat was so enormous that they, I don't know, fainted or something. And then here's King Nebuchadnezzar with his bodyguard seeing all this. And here's his big image out here, and the people playing the instruments that everyone was supposed to bow down to. And you know that Nebuchadnezzar, prior to that, had a dream about these different empires that were going to come and hit. The first one was Babylon, and it was the head of gold. So I think that's where he got his idea that he wanted to make an image of gold so that people would bow down and worship him. So that's mainly the story of the 3 boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, thrown into the fiery furnace. It seemed like in those days they did such drastic things to people.